Sometimes salvation arrives through flames, not despite them. England, 1809. The acrid smell of smoke invaded Lillian Fairmont's dreams before consciousness fully returned. Her eyes flew open to a room filled with grey tendrils curling against the ceiling, growing thicker with each passing second. The familiar contours of her bedchamber at Fairmont Cottage wavered in the darkness, distorted by the haze that now consumed the air she breathed. Panic seized her chest as she threw back the coverlet and stumbled toward the door. Her bare feet met the cold floorboards as flames flickered beneath the gap at the threshold, casting dancing shadows across the walls. She grasped the handle and pulled. Once, twice, then with all her strength. The door would not yield. "Mrs. Hinch," she called out, her voice breaking on the second syllable. "Thomas, anyone, please." Silence answered her, broken only by the ominous crackling that grew louder by the moment. Lillian rushed to the window, fumbling with the latch that had always stuck slightly. Her fingers trembled as she fought against it, but the old mechanism refused to budge. Years of dampness and neglect had sealed it shut as effectively as any lock. The smoke descended lower, burning her throat and stinging her eyes. She pressed her nightgown against her face, backing away from the door where flames now licked through the cracks in the wood. 29 years on this earth, and she would perish in the house where she had been born, where her mother had taught her to identify herbs in the garden below, where her father had read to her by the fireplace that now seemed to mock her with its cold emptiness. Her gardens. The thought struck her with unexpected force. Years of careful cultivation, rare specimens she had nurtured from seeds and cuttings, the medicinal plants that represented everything her mother had passed down before fever claimed her. All of it would be ash by morning. The room tilted as her lungs struggled to find clean air. Lillian sank to her knees beside the bed, her vision blurring. Through the window, she could see the first hints of dawn touching the horizon. So beautiful and so terribly distant. Her fingers clutched at the wooden bedpost as consciousness began to slip away, carrying with it all fear, all regret, leaving only a strange sense of peace. She never heard the crash of the front door giving way below. Julian Montrose, Duke of Windermere, had not expected to return home to the sight of flames consuming his neighbour's property. The meeting in London had run late into the night, and he had chosen to ride through the darkness rather than delay until morning. His horse had been the first to sense something amiss, nickering nervously as they crested the hill that overlooked the narrow valley, separating his estate from the smaller holdings to the east. The orange glow had drawn his attention immediately. Fairmont Cottage, modest but well-maintained, was being devoured by fire that seemed to pour from every window on the ground floor. He drove his heels into his mount's flanks, racing down the slope toward the chaos. An elderly man was throwing his weight against the front door when Julian arrived, his weathered face streaked with soot and desperation. Near the garden fence, a woman in a nightcap lay motionless on the ground, blood darkening her grey hair. "The door's barred from inside," the old man gasped as Julian dismounted. "Miss Lillian, she's trapped upstairs. I can't break through." Julian did not waste time on questions. He backed up several paces, then ran at the door with his shoulder lowered. The impact sent jolts of pain through his arm, but the wood groaned. A second attempt, and the bar inside splintered. The door burst inward, releasing a wave of heat and smoke that forced both men to turn away. "See to the woman," Julian commanded, stripping off his coat. He wrapped it around his head and lower face, then plunged into the inferno. The entrance hall was a vision of destruction. Flames climbed the wallpaper in sheets, consuming the modest furnishings with savage efficiency. The staircase ahead was partially engulfed, but the steps themselves appeared intact. Julian took them two at a time, feeling the heat through the soles of his boots. 3 doors led off the upper hallway. The first stood open, revealing an empty room already claimed by fire. The second the same. The third, at the far end, remained closed. He tried the handle and found it locked. No, not locked, he realized as he examined it more closely. Barred from the outside with a simple metal latch. Something cold settled in his chest that had nothing to do with fear. This was no accident. He threw the latch and shouldered the door open. Smoke poured out in a thick cloud, but the flames had not yet reached this room. A figure lay crumpled beside the bed, clad in a white nightgown that seemed to glow in the dimness. Julian crossed the room in 3 strides and gathered the woman into his arms. She was slight, lighter than he expected, her head lolling against his shoulder. The return journey proved more treacherous than the ascent. The fire had spread with terrifying speed, and portions of the staircase groaned ominously under his weight. Julian held his burden close, shielding her face with his coat as he navigated the failing structure. Behind him, he heard the unmistakable sound of ceiling beams beginning to give way. He cleared the front door, just as a tremendous crash echoed through the building. The upper floor, or part of it, had collapsed inward. The old man rushed forward to help as Julian laid the unconscious woman on the grass, well away from the burning structure. "Is she breathing?" the man asked, his voice raw with smoke and emotion. Julian pressed his fingers to the side of her neck and felt the flutter of a pulse. "Yes, barely. We need to get both of them to Windermere Hall immediately. My physician must be summoned." "I'm Thomas Greaves, Your Grace," the old man said, recognition dawning despite the circumstances. "This is Miss Lillian Fairmont, and that's Mrs. Hinch, her governess. Been with the family 40 years. Julian looked down at the woman in his arms more carefully. Brown hair, tangled and darkened with smoke, fell across a face smudged with soot. She appeared young, perhaps late 20s, though it was difficult to judge in her current state. He had seen her only once before, months ago, riding past his property on an old mare. They had exchanged polite nods, nothing more. "Can you manage Mrs. Hinch?" Julian asked Thomas. "Aye, Your Grace. She took a blow to the head, but she's breathing steady." Julian lifted Miss Fairmont again, this time carrying her toward his horse. The animal shied at the smell of smoke clinging to them both, but years of training held it in place. Thomas followed more slowly with Mrs. Hinch, supporting her weight as best his aged frame allowed. By the time they reached Windermere Hall, servants had been roused by the commotion. Julian's housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, took charge with swift efficiency, directing maids to prepare rooms and sending a footman racing to fetch Dr. Whitmore from the village. Julian remained in the hallway outside the chamber where they had laid Miss Fairmont, unwilling to leave until he knew she would survive. His coat, ruined by smoke and flame, lay discarded on a chair. His hands, he noticed absently, were shaking. Thomas appeared at his elbow, his face grave. "The cottage is lost, Your Grace. Nothing left to save. And the gardens. Destroyed, every last plant." Thomas's voice cracked slightly. "She'll grieve that most of all, I reckon. Those gardens were her whole life, especially after her father passed. Legacy from her mother they were." Julian thought of the woman lying unconscious beyond the door, nearly dead from smoke inhalation, and felt something harden in his chest. The door had been barred from the outside. Someone had wanted her trapped in that room, had wanted her to burn. "Tell me everything you saw, Thomas," he said quietly. "Leave nothing out." Thomas swallowed, soot streaking the creases of his weathered face as he obeyed. In halting bursts, he described the study door that would not yield at first, though the latch had never stuck before, the sharp, clinging reek of lamp oil hanging thicker in the air than it ought. The old oil cans stacked near the back wall where he was certain they had not been the day before. He spoke of finding Mrs. Hinch crumpled in the garden with blood in her hair, and no clear memory of how she had come there, and of the moment the smoke rolled so black across the windows that he could no longer see inside at all. Julian listened without interruption, each new detail hardening the weight in his chest. By the time Thomas fell silent, hoarse and shaking, the Duke had already given his orders. Miss Fairmont and Mrs. Hinch were to be conveyed to Windermere Hall at once, his physician summoned without delay, and every questionable circumstance surrounding the fire examined until the truth was laid bare. Consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by the acrid taste of smoke in Lillian's mouth and a dull ache that seemed to permeate every breath. Her eyes opened to unfamiliar surroundings, walls papered in soft green silk, heavy curtains drawn against daylight that pressed at their edges, furniture of a quality she had never possessed. For a disorienting moment, she wondered if she had died, And this was some peculiar afterlife. Then memory crashed over her with sickening clarity. The smoke, the locked door, the flames eating through the wood as she struggled for air. She sat up too quickly, and the room spun. A gentle hand pressed against her shoulder, easing her back against the pillows. "Slowly now, Miss Fairmont," a woman's voice said. "You've been unconscious for 2 days. Your lungs need time to recover." Lillian turned her head to find Mrs. Hinch seated beside the bed, a bandage wrapped around her head, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mrs. Hinch, you're alive. Thank God you're alive. As are you, my dear girl." The older woman's voice trembled. "Thanks to His Grace, the Duke of Windermere. He pulled you from the flames himself." "The Duke?" Lillian's mind struggled to make sense of this information. She knew of the Duke, of course. Everyone within 20 miles knew of Julian Montrose, whose vast estate bordered her modest property, but they had never exchanged more than passing pleasantries. "Rode up just as the cottage was burning," Mrs. Hinch explained, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Thomas was trying to break down the door. The Duke got you out just before the upper floor collapsed." The gardens. The realization struck Lillian with physical force. "The gardens," she whispered. "My medicinal plants. Everything my mother—" "Gone, child. All of it." Mrs. Hinch took her hand, squeezing gently. "I'm so sorry. Years of work, I know. But you're alive, and that's what matters." Lillian closed her eyes against the tears that threatened. Those gardens had been her solace after her father's death 3 years ago, her connection to a mother lost to fever when she was barely 16. The rare foxglove her mother had cultivated for heart tonics, the feverfew that had taken 5 years to establish properly, the chamomile beds that produced the finest flowers in the county, all reduced to ash. A knock at the door interrupted her grief. A maid entered, followed by a tall man whose presence seemed to fill the room despite his quiet bearing. Dark hair, blue eyes that assessed her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how she must look. 2 days unwashed and dressed in a borrowed nightgown. "Miss Fairmont," he said, his voice measured. "I'm glad to see you awake. I am Julian Montrose. Your Grace." Lillian attempted to sit up properly, but her arms would not support her weight. "I owe you my life. I don't know how to—" "No thanks are necessary." He moved closer, stopping at a respectful distance from the bed. "I'm only relieved we reached you in time. Dr. Whitmore says your lungs will heal fully, though you must rest for at least another week." "A week?" Lillian's mind raced. "Your Grace, I cannot impose on your household for so long. If you could send word to my cousin Hugh in London—" "Thomas Greaves has already sent word." Something in the Duke's tone made her look at him more carefully. "Your cousin arrived this morning, along with his wife and the local magistrate." Mrs. Hinch's hand tightened on Lillian's. "Perhaps Miss Fairmont should rest a bit longer before—" "They're waiting downstairs," the Duke continued, his gaze never leaving Lillian's face. "The magistrate, Mr. Caldwell, has declared the fire an unfortunate accident. A candle left burning, he suggested." "But I never—" Lillian began, then stopped as memory provided a crucial detail. "I blew out all the candles before retiring. I always do. And the door, it wouldn't open. It was locked. Barred from the outside," the Duke said quietly. With a latch that had been recently installed, according to Thomas, the implications of his words settled over her like a shroud. "Someone barred me in. Someone wanted—" "We don't know what someone wanted," Mrs. Hinch interjected quickly, though her expression suggested she had her own suspicions. "All we know is that it's a miracle you survived." "Mrs. Hinch, what happened to you?" Lillian asked, noticing again the bandage around the older woman's head. "That wound—" "I woke to the smell of smoke," Mrs. Hinch said, her voice taking on a distant quality. "I was going to your room when something struck me from behind. When I came to, I was in the garden, and Thomas was dragging me away from the house." Julian watched the exchange with an expression that revealed nothing. "Thomas found you unconscious between the house and the garden beds. Someone clearly struck you, Mrs. Hinch." The physician confirmed as much. A chill that had nothing to do with her weakened state ran through Lillian. "Where is Thomas now?" "Working in my gardens temporarily," the Duke replied. I've employed him to ensure he has income while your property situation is resolved. He asked me to tell you that he'll rebuild the gardens if you wish, once the cottage is repaired. The cottage? Lillian had not even thought about the structure itself. How extensive is the damage? Severe, Julian admitted. The upper floor collapsed entirely. The ground floor is badly compromised. It will require months of work and considerable expense to make it habitable again. I see. Lillian's mind worked furiously despite the exhaustion that pulled at her. The modest savings from her father would not cover such repairs. Then I must sell the property and… Miss Fairmont! The door burst open to admit a man Lillian recognized with sinking dread. Hugh Fairmont, her cousin, had inherited the Viscount title upon her father's death, but not the smaller properties, which had been left to her. He was accompanied by a woman whose elaborate travelling costume and imperious bearing marked her as his wife Constance. "Cousin Hugh," Lillian managed, her voice weaker than she would have liked. "Thank heavens you survived," Hugh said, though his eyes darted around the room with an assessment that had little to do with her health. "Constance and I came as soon as we heard. Terrible business, terrible. Dreadful," Constance agreed, moving to the foot of the bed and examining Lillian with undisguised curiosity. "You poor thing, losing everything in one night. The cottage, the gardens, all your father's papers, I imagine." "His papers?" Lillian frowned. "What concern are my father's papers to anyone?" "Well, naturally, as the heir to the Viscount title, Hugh needs to ensure all the estate matters are properly documented," Constance said smoothly. "The property deeds, the will, all those tedious legal documents. I assume they were kept at the cottage." "They were," Lillian confirmed, watching her cousin's wife carefully. "In my father's study." "Which would have been destroyed in the fire," Hugh said, a note of something that might have been satisfaction creeping into his voice. "Such a loss. Of course, Mr. Vale, our family solicitor, has copies of all the important documents." Julian stepped forward, his movement subtle but effective in drawing attention. "I'm sure Miss Fairmont's property concerns can wait until she is recovered, Mr. Fairmont. She's been unconscious for 2 days and needs rest." A portly man in magistrate's robes appeared in the doorway behind Hugh and Constance. "Quite right, Your Grace. Miss Fairmont, I'm Geoffrey Caldwell. Terribly sorry about this unfortunate accident. These old houses, you know. Dry timber, a carelessly placed candle." "I placed no candles carelessly," Lillian interrupted, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "And someone barred my door from the outside." Caldwell's expression shifted to one of patient condescension. "My dear young woman, you've suffered a terrible shock. Smoke inhalation can create confusion, even false memories. Thomas Greaves mentioned finding some old oil cans near the stables, but he's elderly himself. Probably used them weeks ago and simply forgot." "Thomas forgot nothing," Mrs. Hinch said sharply. "And there's the matter of how I ended up unconscious in the garden with a wound on my head." "You likely tripped in your haste to escape," Caldwell suggested. "A protruding root. Perhaps a stone." Julian's voice cut through the room, cold as winter steel. "Mrs. Hinch's wound shows clear signs of having been struck with a blunt object, according to my physician. The door to Miss Fairmont's chamber was barred from the outside with a newly installed latch, and Thomas found evidence of accelerants near the structure. These are not the hallmarks of an accident, Mr. Caldwell." The magistrate's face reddened. "Your Grace, with all due respect, I've investigated these matters for 20 years. Then perhaps 20 years have dulled your instincts." The Duke's tone remained polite, but something in it made even Caldwell take a step back. "I will be conducting my own investigation into this matter. If you find that objectionable, you may take it up with the Lord Chief Justice in London, who happens to be a personal acquaintance of mine." Hugh moved forward quickly. "Your Grace, surely there's no need for such measures. We're all family here. Whatever happened, I'm certain it was simply a tragic accident. Now, about the property. Lillian, dear cousin, you must see that the cottage is a complete loss. The expense of rebuilding would bankrupt you. The sensible thing would be to sell the land. Constance and I would be happy to take it off your hands for a fair price." Lillian looked at her cousin, seeing him clearly perhaps for the first time. The slight sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool temperature. The way his eyes would not quite meet hers. The too casual mention of property documents that might have burned. "I think not," she said quietly. "That property was my father's gift to me. I will not sell it." Constance's pleasant expression cracked slightly. "Don't be foolish. You have no means to rebuild, no family to support you." "Miss Fairmont is currently a guest in my home," Julian said, his words measured but carrying an unmistakable authority. "She will remain here until she has fully recovered and had time to make decisions about her future free from pressure. I must now insist that she be allowed to rest. Mrs. Hinch will remain with her as companion." "Of course, Your Grace," Hugh said quickly, already backing toward the door. "We only wanted to assure ourselves of dear Lillian's welfare. We'll return to London and wait for word of her recovery. Constance and I are staying at the village inn," Constance added, her smile sharp. "Should you need anything, cousin, you have only to send word." When they had gone, accompanied by the magistrate who cast one last resentful glance at the Duke, silence settled over the room. Lillian found herself trembling, though whether from anger, fear, or simple exhaustion, she could not say. "Your Grace," she began, "I believe we can dispense with such formality under the circumstances," Julian said, pulling a chair close to the bed and settling into it with unexpected ease. "My name is Julian, and I suspect we're going to be spending considerable time together in the coming weeks, Miss Fairmont." "Lillian," she offered, then paused. "You think they're responsible, don't you? Hugh and Constance." "I think several things, none of which I can prove yet." He leaned forward slightly. "But I want you to tell me everything you remember about your cousin's visits in recent months. Every conversation, every request, every detail, no matter how small it may seem." So Lillian told him. About Hugh's increasing pressure to sell the property. About the arguments that had grown more heated with each visit. About the visit 2 days before the fire, when he had asked yet again, and she had refused yet again, her voice rising until Thomas had appeared to ensure everything was well. And as she spoke, as the afternoon light faded beyond the windows and Mrs. Hinch dozed in her chair, Lillian realized that her life had irrevocably changed. The simple existence she had built from the ruins of her father's modest estate, the quiet days spent in her gardens, cultivating the knowledge her mother had passed to her, all of it was gone. What would replace it, she could not yet imagine. But looking at the man who sat listening with such focused attention, she understood that whatever came next, it would begin here, in this borrowed room, with this unexpected alliance. And for the first time since waking, she felt something other than grief. She felt the faint, fragile stirring of hope. By the end of her first week at Windermere Hall, Lillian had grown restless enough to defy Dr. Whitmore's orders. The physician had insisted she remain bedridden for another 3 days, but the walls of the guest chamber, however beautifully appointed, had begun to feel like another kind of prison. When Mrs. Hinch left to take her own afternoon rest, Lillian slipped from beneath the coverlet and made her way slowly down the corridor. She had intended only to walk to the far window, to look out at something beyond these 4 walls. Instead, she found herself descending the main staircase, one hand gripping the polished banister as her legs remembered how to support her weight. No servants appeared to stop her, and she wondered if Julian had given instructions to allow her freedom of movement. The thought of him had occupied more of her mind than she cared to admit. He visited each morning and again in the evening, always correct, always solicitous, yet there was something in the way he listened to her that suggested his interest extended beyond mere duty. When she spoke of her gardens, of the medicinal properties of various plants, his attention never wavered. Most gentlemen of her acquaintance would have found such topics tedious at best. But then, Julian Montrose was unlike any gentleman she had ever encountered. The sound of voices drew her toward the front of the house. Through the tall windows flanking the main entrance, she could see Julian speaking with a man she did not recognize. Both stood beside a travel-worn horse, examining what appeared to be documents. The stranger's plain brown coat and unremarkable features seemed designed to avoid notice, yet something about his bearing suggested competence. "Miss Fairmont." Lillian turned to find Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, regarding her with a mixture of concern and amusement. "You should not be out of bed." "I'll return shortly," Lillian promised. "I simply needed to move. Surely you can understand." "I can," Mrs. Patterson admitted. "But His Grace will have my head if you collapse. At least sit down properly. The morning room is just there, and it overlooks the gardens. Perhaps that would suit you." It suited her perfectly. The morning room proved to be a comfortable space, decorated in shades of cream and gold, with French doors that opened onto a terrace. Beyond the terrace stretched gardens that made Lillian's breath catch. Not the formal parterres common to great houses, but something more natural, with walking paths winding between established beds of perennials and flowering shrubs. "His Grace's mother designed them," Mrs. Patterson said, noting Lillian's interest. "The Dowager Duchess preferred a more English style. His Grace has maintained them exactly as she left them." "They're beautiful," Lillian murmured, moving closer to the glass. Then she saw it, tucked into a corner near what appeared to be a kitchen garden. A small plot of freshly turned earth with stakes marking out neat sections. "What's that area being prepared for?" Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. "Thomas Greaves asked His Grace if he might start a small medicinal garden. For when you were well enough to work in it," he said. His Grace agreed immediately and provided Thomas with whatever he needed. Something in Lillian's chest tightened. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, staring at that plot of dark soil that represented both everything she had lost and the possibility of beginning again. "May I go out?" "Not today," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "But perhaps tomorrow, if you're stronger." With a shawl and Mrs. Hinch beside you. Lillian had to content herself with that promise. She settled into a chair near the window, unable to look away from the gardens. Mrs. Patterson brought tea and departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the view. It was there that Julian found her 20 minutes later, accompanied by the plain-featured man from outside. "Lillian," Julian said, surprise evident in his voice. "Should you be out of bed?" "I grew tired of looking at the same ceiling," she replied, then added, "I'm sorry if I've overstepped." "Not at all. This is hardly a sick room." He gestured to the man beside him. "May I introduce Mr. Nathaniel Fletcher? He's a private investigator from London, and I've engaged him to look into the circumstances of the fire." Fletcher bowed correctly. "Miss Fairmont, I'm pleased to see you recovering." "An investigator?" Lillian looked between the two men. "Then you truly believe it wasn't an accident?" "I believe we should rule out all other possibilities before accepting that conclusion," Julian said carefully. He took the seat across from her while Fletcher remained standing. "Mr. Fletcher has already made some interesting discoveries. Your cousin, Mr. Hugh Fairmont, has accumulated substantial debts," Fletcher said, his voice matter-of-fact. "Gaming debts primarily, owed to several rather unsavory moneylenders in London. The amounts are considerable, and the lenders in question are known for their impatience with delayed payment." Lillian's hands tightened in her lap. "How much does he owe?" "Enough that the sale of your property would cover perhaps half of it," Fletcher replied, "which suggests he has other sources of income planned or other properties to sell." "He has none," Lillian said quietly. "My father's title went to him, but the only significant property was Fairmont Cottage, which was left to me. Hugh lives beyond his means in London on credit and the small annual income from the Viscountcy." "Then he's desperate," Julian observed. "Desperate men make poor decisions." "There's more," Fletcher continued. "I took the liberty of speaking with several shopkeepers in the village near your property, Miss Fairmont. Your cousin's wife, Mrs. Constance Fairmont, was seen 2 days before the fire meeting with a man named Jacob Kerr. He has a rather distinctive scar across his face and a reputation for taking on work of a questionable nature." "What sort of work?" Lillian asked, though she already feared the answer. "Intimidation. Destruction of property. He's been suspected in several fires over the years, though nothing was ever proven." Fletcher's expression remained neutral, but his words carried weight. "I'm attempting to locate him now, but men like Kerr know how to disappear when they sense investigation." Lillian felt the room tilt slightly. Someone had truly tried to kill her, not in the heat of passion or by accident, but with cold calculation. Hugh and Constance had likely planned it, hired someone to carry it out. and would have succeeded if not for Julian's fortuitous arrival. Lillian. Julian's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. He had moved to kneel beside her chair, his hand covering hers where they gripped the armrest. You're safe here. I give you my word. But Mrs. Hinch, she could have died trying to save me. Thomas as well if he had entered the building. Her voice shook despite her attempt to control it. Because Hugh wants money I don't even have. The property's value lies mainly in the land, and it's not enough to solve his problems even if I did sell. Which suggests either his desperation has overcome his reason, or he believes there's something else at the property worth having, Julian said. His hand remained on hers, warm and steady. The papers Constance mentioned. What exactly did your father keep in his study? Lillian forced herself to think past the fear. Estate documents, personal correspondence, records of transactions and rents from when he still maintained tenants on the land. She paused, memory stirring. And his will, though that was already filed with the solicitor. Mr. Vale, according to your cousin, Fletcher interjected. I've made discreet inquiries of my own. He has practiced law in London for 20 years, primarily serving minor gentry families. His reputation is respectable enough on the surface, but there are small inconsistencies in his accounts that suggest a willingness to bend the rules when it suits him. He keeps a small staff, a junior clerk of no great consequence in the eyes of most men. The fellow could scarcely meet my eye when I mentioned your name, Miss Fairmont. I very much doubt he has the stomach for outright villainy, though he appears entangled in it. I did discover he's known Hugh since they attended school together. Coincidence? Lillian asked, though she already knew it was not. Unlikely, Julian agreed. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens. If Vale and Hugh are in collusion, they might have tampered with documents. The fire would have been useful in destroying evidence of such tampering. But why bother? Lillian rose as well, ignoring the slight unsteadiness in her legs. The will was proven. I inherited the property legally. Even if the documents at the cottage burned, the official records remain. Unless those official records are not what you believe them to be, Julian said quietly. He turned to face her. What if Vale filed a false will? What if the true document says something different? The implications crashed over Lillian. You think my father left the property to Hugh, but Vale changed it to show I inherited instead. No, that makes no sense. Why would Vale favour me over his friend? Not favour you, Fletcher said, but perhaps the true will left the property to Hugh, and Vale convinced him that an altered version leaving it to you would be more advantageous. You would be pressured to sell. Hugh would buy it at a reduced price, and they would split the profit. But you refused to sell. So they decided to eliminate me and claim the property outright. Lillian sank back into the chair, her mind reeling. This is madness. It's speculation, Julian corrected. But Mr. Fletcher and I agree it's worth investigating, which means we need to examine the official will filed in London. A knock at the door interrupted them. A footman entered carrying a silver tray. Pardon the intrusion, Your Grace. This letter arrived by special messenger for Miss Fairmont. Lillian took the sealed envelope with trembling fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the paper of decent but not exceptional quality. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet within. The words were brief and unsigned. Vale falsified documents. Testamentary original archived at Canterbury Cathedral's record office. From someone who still possesses a conscience. She read it twice before passing it to Julian. He and Fletcher examined it together, their expressions growing thoughtful. Well, Fletcher said after a moment. That's remarkably convenient. Or remarkably suspicious, Julian added. Anonymous warnings are often traps. But if it's true, Lillian looked between them. Canterbury is only a day's travel. We could verify this easily enough. We, Julian repeated, and something in his tone made her straighten. You intend to come along? It's my inheritance, my father's estate. Of course I'll come. She raised her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. I'm stronger than I look, Your Grace. I've managed my property alone for 3 years, with a staff of 2 elderly retainers and gardens. Julian pointed out, though his lips twitched with what might have been amusement. This is rather different. All the more reason I should be involved. Lillian stood, gratified when her legs held steady. When do we leave? Fletcher glanced at Julian, who studied Lillian with an intensity that made her acutely aware of her borrowed dress, her hair that had not seen a proper lady's maid in over a week. Then he smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually austere features. Day after tomorrow, he said. That gives you time to rest another day and ensure Dr. Whitmore doesn't have my head. Fletcher, continue investigating Kerr and make discreet inquiries about Vale's recent activities. We'll confer before the Canterbury journey. Fletcher departed, leaving Lillian alone with Julian in the morning room. The sunlight streaming through the windows seemed brighter somehow, the gardens beyond more vivid. Or perhaps it was simply that she had a purpose again, something beyond grieving what she had lost. Thank you, she said quietly, for believing me, for investigating when the magistrate seemed content to dismiss everything as accident. Caldwell is a fool who's been magistrate too long, Julian replied, and I suspect he has his own reasons for wanting this matter closed quickly. Thomas mentioned their old school friends, he and Hugh. Everyone seems connected to Hugh, Lillian observed. Vale, Caldwell. It's as though he's spent years building a network of people willing to overlook his indiscretions, or participate in them. Julian moved closer, his expression serious. Lillian, I must ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Is there any possibility your father harboured doubts about leaving you the property? Any conversations where he suggested Hugh might be a better steward, given that you're unmarried? The question stung, but she understood why he had to ask. None. My father knew I loved that land, that I had no wish to marry and give control to a husband. He told me more than once that the cottage would be mine, that I would always have security. Her voice dropped. He knew what it was to lose someone you love. My mother's death devastated him. He wanted to ensure I would never be dependent on anyone's charity. Then we proceed on the assumption that the will filed by Vale is fraudulent, Julian said. And we prepare for whatever we might find in Canterbury. A thought occurred to Lillian. Your Grace, this investigation, Mr. Fletcher's services, these things are expensive. I have some savings, but not enough to repay you for... Don't. The single word stopped her. This isn't a debt, Lillian. Someone tried to murder you on property that borders mine. Even if I felt no personal obligation, which I do, I would still investigate for the safety of my own estate and tenants. But you do, she said softly. Feel a personal obligation, I mean. For a moment, he simply looked at her. Then he said, equally soft, yes, though I'm not entirely certain when that began. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile and profound. Lillian felt her heartbeat quicken, felt the warmth rising to her cheeks. This was dangerous territory, a duke and the penniless daughter of a minor viscount. Nothing could come of it but heartache. Yet when Julian smiled at her again, she found herself smiling back, unable to help herself. Come, he said, offering his arm. Let me show you the medicinal garden Thomas has started. I think you'll find he's remembered the layout from your original beds. She took his arm, grateful for the support as they walked through the French doors and out into the sunlight. The gardens stretched before them, and in their corner, that small plot of dark soil waited for seeds and cuttings, and all the knowledge Lillian carried in her hands and heart. It wasn't what she had lost, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be the beginning of something new. The journey to Canterbury began on a morning bright with autumn sunlight. Lillian had spent the previous day working in the medicinal garden with Thomas, her hands remembering their purpose as she pressed seeds into the dark soil. The activity had steadied her, reminded her that some things could be rebuilt even after complete destruction. Still, as she settled into Julian's well-appointed carriage, with Mrs. Hinch beside her, nervousness fluttered in her stomach. Fletcher had departed the previous evening with disturbing news. Hugh's debts were even more substantial than initially reported, and several of his creditors were men known for violent methods of collection. If Hugh did not secure funds soon, the consequences would extend well beyond social embarrassment. As for Jacob Kerr, the scarred man Constance had met, he had indeed left the area shortly after the fire, but Fletcher had tracked his general direction toward Dover. Men fleeing to the continent rarely do so with clear consciences, Fletcher had said before taking his leave. Now, as the carriage rolled through the countryside, Julian sat across from Lillian, reviewing documents he had brought from his study. He had been quiet since they departed, his brow furrowed in concentration, and she found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. How strange that a man she had barely known 2 weeks ago now occupied so much of her thoughts. "You're staring," he said without looking up. Though his lips curved slightly, Lillian felt heat rush to her cheeks. "I was merely thinking." "About?" Now he did look up, his blue eyes meeting hers with that unsettling directness she was coming to recognize. "About how quickly one's life can change," she admitted. 2 weeks ago I had a home, gardens I had spent years cultivating, a routine I understood. Now everything is uncertain." Mrs. Hinch patted her hand. "But you're alive, child. That's what matters." "Mrs. Hinch is correct," Julian said. "Though I understand the grief that comes with such upheaval." Something flickered across his face, there and gone before she could identify it. Change can be devastating even when it leads somewhere better. "Speaking from experience, Your Grace?" Lillian asked, emboldened by the enclosed space and his unusually contemplative mood. He was silent for a moment, his fingers stilling on the papers. Then he said, "My wife died 5 years ago. The marriage was arranged by our families, as such unions often are among the aristocracy. We were civil to one another, even friendly in our way, but there was no affection between us. When she succumbed to fever, I grieved more for what we had never shared than for what I had lost." The admission hung in the carriage, intimate and unexpected. Lillian felt Mrs. Hinch shift beside her, equally startled by such candor. "I'm sorry," Lillian said quietly. "That sounds unutterably lonely." "It was," Julian agreed, "though I didn't fully understand that until recently. Strange how proximity to someone who actually listens when you speak can illuminate what was missing from years of polite indifference." His gaze remained on her, and Lillian found she could not look away. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken understanding. She knew precisely what he meant. In the hours they had spent discussing her property, her gardens, the investigation into the fire, she had felt more genuinely seen than in years of superficial social interactions. "Well," Mrs. Hinch said with determined cheerfulness, "I believe I'll close my eyes for a bit. The motion of the carriage always makes me drowsy." She did close her eyes, but Lillian suspected the older woman simply wished to give them privacy. The gesture was both touching and mortifying. "We shouldn't," Lillian began, then stopped, unsure what exactly they shouldn't do. "Shouldn't what?" Julian's voice held a trace of amusement. "Speak honestly to one another. I thought we had moved past such constraints." "You're a duke," she pointed out. "I'm the daughter of a minor viscount, currently without property or prospects. People will talk if they haven't already. Let them talk." He set his papers aside, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Lillian, I have spent 5 years doing precisely what was expected of me, maintaining appearances, fulfilling duties, never stepping outside the bounds society has drawn. It has been a particularly tedious form of prison. I find I have little interest in continuing that way." "What are you saying?" Her heart beat faster, though whether from hope or fear she could not determine. "I'm saying that whatever we discover in Canterbury, whatever comes from this investigation, I would like to continue knowing you, as more than a neighbor whose property borders mine, as more than someone I happened to rescue from a fire." He paused. "If that is agreeable to you, The careful phrasing, the way he waited for her response rather than simply declaring his intentions, it spoke to a respect she had rarely encountered. Most men of her acquaintance presumed, they announced, they expected compliance. Julian asked. "It's agreeable," she said, the words barely above a whisper. "Very much so." His smile transformed his usually serious features, and for a moment she glimpsed the man beneath the title and the responsibilities. Then the carriage jolted over a rough patch of road, and the moment passed, leaving only the warmth of understanding between them. A fortnight had passed since the night of the fire, enough time for the worst of the smoke to leave Lillian's lungs, but not nearly enough for the memories to fade. They reached Canterbury as the cathedral bells tolled 3. The ancient city spread before them, dominated by the magnificent cathedral that had stood for centuries. Julian's servants had arranged rooms at a respectable inn, and after a brief rest to refresh themselves, they proceeded to the record office. The keeper of records was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles perched precariously on his nose. He regarded them with the suspicion common to those who guard important documents. "The will of Viscount Fairmont," he repeated when Julian explained their purpose. "Filed 3 years ago upon his death." "Yes, we maintain a copy, though I must ask what business—" "Miss Fairmont is the Viscount's daughter," Julian interrupted smoothly. "There is some question about the accuracy of the version filed with the probate court. We simply wish to compare them." The keeper's eyebrows rose, but he disappeared into the stacks without further argument. The authority in Julian's voice, the ducal bearing, clearly carried weight even in this repository of aged paper and legal precision. When he returned, he carried a document case which he opened with reverent care. The will within bore her father's seal, his signature, the formal language she remembered from when he had explained his intentions to her years ago. But as they read, Lillian felt cold certainty settle over her. This was not the will that had been probated. "The property known as Fairmont Cottage and all its lands and contents are hereby bequeathed to my cousin, Hugh Fairmont," she read aloud, her voice shaking, "upon condition that he provides suitable housing and maintenance for my daughter, Lillian Fairmont, for the duration of her natural life." "That's not what Vale filed," Mrs. Hinch said, her face pale. "The probated will left everything to you outright, with a small bequest to Hugh." "Exactly backward," Julian murmured, scanning the rest of the document. "This version makes Hugh the owner, with an obligation to support Lillian. The fraudulent version gave her everything." "But why?" Lillian struggled to understand. "Why would Vale falsify it in my favour? What would Hugh gain from that?" "Control," Julian said grimly, "and profit. If you owned the property, you could be pressured to sell. The proceeds would go to you, of course, but Hugh could offer to help manage the sale, take a commission, perhaps negotiate a price favourable to a buyer he selected, someone who might kick back a portion of the purchase price to him." "But I refused to sell," Lillian whispered, "which ruined their scheme. So they decided to eliminate you and revert to the original will," Mrs. Hinch finished, her voice tight with anger, "making it look like an accident. Hugh would inherit as the document actually states, and no one would question it." The keeper of records had listened to this exchange with growing alarm. "Are you suggesting fraud, Your Grace? Legal documents tampering?" "I'm stating it with certainty," Julian replied. "This will is dated and sealed. It predates the probated version by several months according to these records. Can you provide us with certified copies?" "I can, though I must inform the authorities if there's suspicion of criminal activity." "Please do," Julian said. "In fact, I would be grateful if you would send word immediately to the Lord Chief Justice in London. Tell him Julian Montrose requests his personal attention to this matter." They left the record office with sealed copies of the true will, proof of Vale's deception in their hands. Outside, the afternoon sun slanted across the cathedral stones, beautiful and uncaring. Lillian stood on the steps, trying to absorb what they had discovered. "My father wanted Hugh to have the property," she said numbly. "I never knew. He told me it would be mine." "Perhaps he changed his mind and never updated the document," Julian suggested gently. "Or perhaps he discussed intentions with you that he did not formalize. Either way, the legal reality is clear." "I have nothing," Lillian continued, the words hollow. "Everything I believed was mine, everything I fought to keep. None of it was ever truly mine at all." Mrs. Hinch embraced her, and Lillian stood rigid in the older woman's arms, too shocked even for tears. She had been so certain, so sure of her rights, of her father's wishes. To discover it had all been built on fraud, even fraud that temporarily benefited her, left her unmoored. "Lillian." Julian's hand on her shoulder was warm, solid, real. "Look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "You have not lost everything," he said firmly. "You have your life, which Hugh tried to take. You have friends who care for you. And you now have evidence of a conspiracy to commit murder. That gives you power, not powerlessness." "Ah, but the property. The property is Hugh's legally, yes. But he hired someone to kill you. When we prove that, his inheritance becomes forfeit as proceeds of a crime. The property will likely escheat to the crown, which means you can petition for its return, given the extraordinary circumstances." Fletcher materialized beside them as if summoned. "Your Grace, Miss Fairmont, I believe I have news that will interest you greatly." They moved away from the record office steps to a quieter corner of the square. Fletcher's expression held grim satisfaction. "I found Jacob Kerr," he said without preamble. "He was drinking himself into a stupor at a tavern in Dover, waiting for a ship to France. When I mentioned the name Constance Fairmont, he became remarkably cooperative. Seems she paid him only half his fee for the fire, promised the rest after you were confirmed dead. Since you survived, he received nothing further and feels rather ill-used." "He confessed?" Julian asked sharply. "In detail," Fletcher confirmed. "To setting the fire, to being paid by Mrs. Fairmont, to knowing the door would be barred. He claims he didn't know anyone was meant to die in it, says she told him it was just to destroy property. But he's willing to testify that she hired him, especially now that he realizes he's wanted for attempted murder rather than simple arson." "Where is he now?" Lillian asked. "Secured and on his way to London in the custody of a rather capable associate of mine. I've also sent word to the magistrates there. Caldwell may be useless, but there are honest men in the system still." Fletcher's expression softened slightly as he looked at Lillian. "I'm sorry, Miss Fairmont. I know this must be difficult." "Difficult," Lillian repeated, then laughed, a sound with no humour in it. "My cousin tried to murder me for property that was rightfully his to begin with. His wife hired an assassin. My father's solicitor committed fraud. And I've just learned that everything I thought I knew about my inheritance was a lie. Difficult seems rather inadequate." "We should return to Windermere," Mrs. Hinch said, her arm still around Lillian's shoulders. "You need rest, my dear. This has been too much." But Lillian shook her head. "No, I need to understand the rest. Fletcher, you said Hugh's debts were substantial. How much time does he have before his creditors act?" "A week at most," Fletcher replied. "Possibly less. These are not patient men." "So even with his legal inheritance, he needed the property sold immediately," Lillian said, thinking aloud. "Which meant convincing me to sell, or eliminating me and doing it himself." "Precisely," Julian confirmed. "A man drowning in debt makes desperate choices." "Then we proceed to London," Lillian said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "We present our evidence to the authorities. We see this through to the end." Julian studied her. "Are you certain? No one would fault you for stepping back, letting the legal system handle." "The legal system tried to burn me alive in my bed," Lillian interrupted. "Or at least, people exploiting its failures did. I will see this through, Julian. I need to." He nodded slowly, then turned to Fletcher. "Send word ahead to London. I want Vale arrested before he has a chance to flee or destroy evidence. And have someone watch Hugh and Constance. If they realize we've discovered the truth, they might try to disappear." As Fletcher departed to arrange these matters, Lillian stood in the Canterbury Square and felt something shift inside her. The shock remained, the grief for what she had lost and what she had never truly possessed. But underneath it grew something harder, something that refused to be defined by others' deceptions. She had survived fire. She would survive this too. And perhaps when it was over, she would discover what it meant to build a life on truth rather than lies, on choice rather than inheritance, on foundations that could not be burned away. Beside her, Julian's presence was steady, unwavering. She did not yet know what shape that life might take. But for the first time since waking to smoke and flames, she allowed herself to hope it might include something beyond mere survival. It might include happiness. The arrests happened with remarkable swiftness once Julian brought the full weight of his influence to bear. Edmund Vale was taken into custody at his London office. his protests of innocence echoing through the building as constables led him away. Hugh Fairmont, found at his club attempting to negotiate yet another loan, went pale as death when informed of the charges. But it was Constance who provided the most dramatic scene. Fletcher's associate, a stolid man named Davies, later described how she had received them in her drawing room, wearing a morning dress that cost more than most families earned in a year. When confronted with Jacob Kerr's confession, she had simply stared at them for a long moment, before her carefully composed expression shattered. "You don't understand," she had said, her voice rising to a pitch that brought servants running. "We had no choice. The debts, the threats, they would have ruined us completely. Hugh was too weak to do what needed to be done, so I had to act." The confession had tumbled out then, witnessed by 3 constables and Fletcher himself. How she had found Kerr through a moneylender's enforcer. How she had paid him to set the fire, instructing him to ensure all doors and windows were secured. How Hugh had visited 2 days before to confirm Lillian would be sleeping in her usual chamber, and to install a new latch on the outside of her door under the pretense of improved security. She refused to sell, Constance had continued, her composure dissolving into something approaching hysteria. Month after month she refused. That wretched little property with its gardens and its memories. She could have saved us, but she was selfish, so selfish. What use was it to her anyway? She had no husband, no children. What did she need it for? By the time they had taken her away, she was screaming about the unfairness of it all, about how women like Lillian, who refused to marry and serve their families, deserved whatever fate befell them. The social humiliation of being led from her home in restraints, of having her neighbours witness her disgrace, seemed to break something fundamental in her mind. Julian recounted all of this to Lillian 3 days later in his study at Windermere Hall. They had returned from Canterbury the previous evening, and she had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of flames and accusations. Now, seated across from him in the comfortable leather chairs he favoured for business discussions, she felt numb as he detailed the confessions and evidence. Vale attempted to claim he acted on Hugh's instructions exclusively, Julian continued, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. But correspondence found in his office tells another story. He and Hugh had been planning this for months, perhaps longer. The forged will was always meant to be temporary, a means to pressure you into selling. When you proved more stubborn than anticipated, they escalated. "And Caldwell?" Lillian asked. "The magistrate who so quickly declared it an accident has been suspended from his position pending investigation into his connection with Hugh and several other questionable decisions over the years." Julian's expression darkened. "It seems my threat to contact the Lord Chief Justice had teeth after all. When the scandal of the fraud emerged, others came forward with complaints about Caldwell's conduct. A farmer whose land dispute was ruled against him, despite clear evidence in his favour. A widow whose assault complaint was dismissed. The extent of his corruption is still being determined. So many people willing to look the other way," Lillian murmured, "or actively participate in wrongdoing. For money, for friendship, for fear of consequence." Julian leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly weary. "The world is full of such compromises, Lillian. I wish I could tell you otherwise." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Hinch entered, followed by Thomas Greaves. The old gardener held his cap in his weathered hands, his expression grave. "Begging your pardon, Your Grace, Miss Lillian," he said, "but I thought you should hear this directly from me. I've been to the cottage. What's left of it, anyway?" Lillian straightened. "Is it salvageable?" "The structure?" "No, miss. The fire took too much. But I walked the grounds, examined what remained." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "I found evidence of oil poured along the foundation, just as I suspected. And I found this." He produced a small metal object from his pocket and placed it on Julian's desk. It was a locket, tarnished and slightly melted, but still recognizable. "That's my mother's," Lillian breathed, reaching for it. "I kept it in my bedside table. I thought it would have been destroyed in the fire. It was thrown clear when part of the floor collapsed," Thomas explained. "Landed in the garden, away from the worst of the flames. I cleaned it up as best I could. Lillian opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside, protected by the metal casing, were two miniature portraits. Her mother on one side, young and smiling. Her father on the other, his expression serious but kind. Below their images, in her mother's delicate handwriting, was inscribed, "For Lillian, our greatest joy." Something broke in Lillian then, some dam that had held back the full force of her emotions these past weeks. She pressed the locket to her chest and wept, finally allowing herself to mourn, not just what she had lost, but what had been taken from her through deliberate cruelty. Mrs. Hinch knelt beside her chair, offering comfort as she had done since Lillian was a child. Thomas stood awkwardly near the door, clearly wishing he had brought better news along with the locket. And Julian simply waited, his presence steady and undemanding, until the storm of grief passed. "I'm sorry," Lillian finally managed, wiping at her eyes with the handkerchief Mrs. Hinch pressed into her hand. "I thought I had accepted it all. But you don't have to apologize for grief," Julian said quietly. "Especially not grief this justified." "What happens now?" Lillian asked, though she was not entirely certain what she was asking. What happened to the property? To her? To any possibility of a future that made sense? "Legally, the property reverts to Hugh as the true heir according to your father's will," Julian explained. "However, given that Hugh is now charged with conspiracy to commit murder and will almost certainly be convicted, his assets will be seized by the Crown. Properties obtained through criminal activity are forfeit. So I have no claim to any of it," Lillian said, the words hollow. "Not legally, no, but I spoke with the Lord Chief Justice yesterday. Given the extraordinary circumstances, that your father clearly intended to provide for you, that you were nearly murdered because of this property, that you've maintained and improved the land for 3 years believing it yours, there is precedent for a petition. The Crown could grant you ownership, or at minimum a lifetime tenancy with income from the property. That could take years," Mrs. Hinch interjected. "Appeals to the Crown don't happen swiftly." "No," Julian agreed, "which is why I'd like to propose an alternative solution, at least temporarily." Lillian looked at him, trying to read his expression and failing. "What sort of solution?" "The medicinal garden you've been cultivating here has flourished under your care. Thomas tells me you have considerable knowledge of herbs and their properties, knowledge that could be quite valuable if properly developed." He leaned forward, his gaze intent. "I would like to propose a business partnership. I will provide land, funding for greenhouses and equipment, and space to establish a proper medicinal garden operation. You would provide your expertise, manage the cultivation, and develop the operation. We would split any profits from sales to apothecaries and physicians according to the investment and labor contributed." The offer struck Lillian silent. It was precisely the kind of arrangement that could give her independence, purpose, and the means to support herself without relying on anyone's charity. But it was also far more than a mere business proposition, and they both knew it. "That's quite generous," she finally said, choosing her words carefully. "But people would talk. A duke and an unmarried woman in business together, spending time alone, working closely." "Let them talk," Julian interrupted. "I found that the opinions of people who would condemn resourcefulness and partnership bore me profoundly." "Your Grace," Thomas interjected hesitantly, "if I may speak plain." "Please do," Julian said. The garden at the cottage, before it burned. Miss Lillian had built something remarkable there. Rare plants, carefully cultivated knowledge, connections with physicians who valued her work. She could have made a proper income from it given time. He turned to Lillian. "This partnership His Grace offers, it could be that, and more. Seems to me a woman who survived what you survived deserves the chance to build something that can't be taken away by fraud or fire." "Thomas is correct," Mrs. Hinch added. "And for what it's worth, my dear, I think you should accept. Not because you have no other options, but because this could be what you choose freely." Lillian looked between them all. Thomas, who had served her family faithfully for decades. Mrs. Hinch, who had been more mother than servant since her actual mother died. And Julian, whose careful expression could not quite hide the hope in his eyes. "I accept," she said. the words steady despite the tumult of emotions within her. On the condition that the arrangement is formalized in writing, with clear terms that protect both parties. I won't have anyone suggest I took advantage of your generosity, and I won't be accused of impropriety I haven't earned. Agreed, Julian said immediately. I'll have my solicitor draw up a proper contract. You should have your own legal representation review it before signing. I don't have a solicitor, Lillian pointed out. Mine just tried to have me murdered. Then we'll find you one who hasn't, Julian replied. And despite everything, Lillian found herself smiling at his dry tone. Later that afternoon, after Thomas had returned to his work and Mrs. Hinch had gone to rest, Lillian stood in the small medicinal garden they had established. The plants were still young, barely established, but they were growing. She could see the potential in the neat rows, could imagine the greenhouses Julian had mentioned, the expanded beds, the possibilities. It's not what I lost, Julian's voice came from behind her. She had not heard him approach, but she was growing accustomed to his uncanny ability to appear when she was deep in thought. No, she agreed, but perhaps it's something better, something I chose rather than inherited, something built on honesty rather than fraud. I meant what I said about not caring what people say, Julian continued, moving to stand beside her. But I should acknowledge that there will be talk. About you living here, about our business arrangement, about the time we spend together. If that becomes unbearable. It won't, Lillian interrupted. I've been disregarded by society for years as an unmarried woman with no prospects and no important connections. Their gossip cannot hurt me worse than indifference already has. Still, Julian said quietly, you should know that my interest in this partnership extends beyond the merely commercial. Lillian's heart beat faster, but she kept her voice steady. I'm aware. And? She turned to face him fully. And I find I'm quite interested in exploring where such an arrangement might lead. Once the legal matters are settled, and I'm not quite so dependent on your hospitality that my judgment might be compromised. That's remarkably practical of you, Julian observed, though his eyes held warmth. I've learned the value of practicality recently, Lillian replied, along with the dangers of assumptions and false foundations. If something is to develop between us, Julian, I would prefer it be built on certainty. I can respect that, he said, though I reserve the right to make my intentions abundantly clear in the meantime. I would expect nothing less, Lillian said, and this time when she smiled, she felt it reach all the way through her. The arrests, the confessions, the scandal that had engulfed Hugh and Constance and their co-conspirators, all of it was terrible and tragic. But standing in this garden with possibility stretching before her, Lillian felt something she had not felt since waking to smoke and flames. She felt free. Not free from hardship or uncertainty. Not free from the necessity of rebuilding everything she had lost, but free from the weight of others' deceptions, free to make choices based on truth rather than manipulated circumstances, free to imagine a future that belonged to her and no one else. It was, she reflected, a far more valuable inheritance than any property could ever be. The Dowager Duchess, Eleanor Montrose, arrived at Windermere Hall on a bright morning, 4 days after the arrests, her carriage bearing the ducal crest and her reputation preceding her by several hours. Servants whispered as they prepared rooms. Mrs. Hinch grew uncharacteristically nervous. Even Julian, normally unflappable, displayed subtle signs of tension as he awaited his mother's arrival in the drawing room. Lillian had heard of the Dowager Duchess, of course. Everyone within 50 miles had heard of her. She was known for her exacting standards, her iron will, and her single-minded determination to see the Montrose family maintain its position among England's premier aristocratic houses. It was she who had arranged Julian's first marriage to the daughter of a marquis, a union designed to strengthen political alliances and consolidate wealth. That it had brought her son no happiness was, apparently, of secondary concern. When Eleanor swept into the drawing room, Lillian rose from her chair with as much composure as she could muster. The Dowager Duchess was a formidable woman in her mid-50s, her silver hair elegantly coiffed, her travelling costume of deep purple silk immaculate, despite hours on the road. Her eyes, the same striking blue as Julian's, assessed Lillian with an intensity that made her feel uncomfortably transparent. "Mother," Julian said, moving forward to greet her with a kiss on her cheek. "Your journey was tolerable, I trust?" "As tolerable as such things ever are," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying the crisp tones of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Though I confess myself eager to understand the situation that prompted 3 separate letters from concerned acquaintances about improper arrangements at my son's estate." "Miss Lillian Fairmont," Julian said, gesturing toward Lillian. "Daughter of the late Viscount Fairmont." "Lillian, my mother, Eleanor, Dowager Duchess of Windermere." Lillian curtsied correctly. "Your Grace, I'm honoured to meet you." "Are you indeed?" Eleanor's gaze did not waver. "How pleasant to hear. Do sit down, Miss Fairmont. I find myself curious about the young woman whose presence in my son's home has caused such remarkable gossip." They settled into seats arranged near the fireplace. Mrs. Patterson appeared with tea, and for several minutes, the ritual of pouring and serving provided merciful distraction. Then Eleanor set down her cup and turned her full attention to Lillian. "I understand there was a fire," she said, "and that Julian rescued you from it, a dramatic beginning to any acquaintance." "He saved my life," Lillian replied simply. "Without his intervention, I would have perished. And your home was destroyed, leaving you without means or shelter." Eleanor's tone remained neutral, but her eyes missed nothing. "Convenient, some might say." "Mother," Julian's voice held warning. "I speak plainly because I must," Eleanor continued, unperturbed. "You are a duke, Julian, with responsibilities to your name and station. Taking in a young woman without family or chaperone, regardless of how noble your intentions, invites exactly the sort of speculation that I have spent decades working to prevent for this family." "Mrs. Hinch serves as Miss Fairmont's companion," Julian pointed out. "And if you had taken time to read my letters rather than listening to gossips, you would understand that Miss Fairmont is the victim of an attempted murder orchestrated by her own family members." This, at least, gave Eleanor pause. "Murder?" Julian explained the circumstances: the barred door, the hired arsonist, the fraudulent will, Hugh and Constance's arrests. As he spoke, Eleanor's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching shock, then to a tightly controlled anger that Lillian suspected was formidable when fully unleashed. "These accusations are proven?" Eleanor asked when Julian finished. "Confessions have been obtained from all parties involved," Julian confirmed. "The evidence is overwhelming. Miss Fairmont very nearly died for property that was never legally hers to begin with." Eleanor turned to Lillian. "And your father, Viscount Fairmont? I recall him vaguely, a scholarly man, I believe. Rather removed from society after his wife's death. He was devoted to my mother," Lillian said quietly. "When she died, something in him died as well. He withdrew to our small estate and focused on his books and his duties to his tenants. He was a good man, Your Grace, but not a worldly one. I suspect he trusted his solicitor far more than he should have." "Men often do," Eleanor observed. "Place trust where it is unwarranted and wonder why they are betrayed." She paused, studying Lillian with renewed interest. "You've been managing the property yourself for 3 years. Since your father's death." "I have. Or rather, I believed I was managing my own property." Lillian met Eleanor's gaze steadily. "I maintained the gardens, managed what little income the land provided, and attempted to live independently. Clearly, I failed to properly verify the legal foundation of my inheritance." "You were deceived by professionals who made deception their business," Eleanor corrected. "That is hardly failure. What will you do now?" The directness of the question caught Lillian off guard. "I'm not entirely certain. Julian has proposed a business partnership." "Has he indeed?" Eleanor's eyebrows rose as she turned to her son. "And what does this partnership entail?" Julian explained the medicinal garden operation, the plans for greenhouses and expanded cultivation, the division of investment and profits. As he spoke, Eleanor listened with the focused attention of someone who had managed estates and business interests for decades. "It's a sound proposition," she said when he finished. "Medicinal herbs are increasingly valuable, and apothecaries in London pay well for quality stock. But Julian," Surely you understand how such an arrangement will be perceived. A young, unmarried woman living under your roof while engaging in business with you. You might as well announce to society that she's your mistress. Then society can think what it likes, Julian replied, his tone hardening. I'm done caring about their opinions, mother. You say that because you've never truly suffered their censure, Eleanor said sharply. I have. And more importantly, Miss Fairmont will suffer it far more than you, because society always judges women more harshly than men. Is that what you want for her? The question hung in the air, unanswerable. Lillian felt her cheeks warm, understanding the truth in Eleanor's words. Julian's reputation might suffer mild tarnish. Hers would be destroyed entirely. Your Grace, Lillian said carefully, I appreciate your concern, but I must point out that my reputation is already quite damaged. I'm 29, unmarried, and have lived independently for years. Society has long since written me off as a peculiar spinster with no prospects. Their additional censure changes little. Eleanor regarded her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled, a small, genuine expression that transformed her austere features. You have courage, Miss Fairmont, and honesty, which is rarer still. Very well. Let us speak privately, you and I. Julian, leave us. Mother. Now, Julian, I wish to speak with Miss Fairmont alone. Julian looked to Lillian, clearly reluctant. She nodded slightly, and after a moment, he withdrew, closing the door behind him. The room felt suddenly smaller, more intimate, with just the two women remaining. Eleanor settled back in her chair, her gaze softening imperceptibly. Do you know why I arranged my son's first marriage? The question surprised Lillian. To strengthen the family's position, I imagine. Yes, and because I believed that was what mothers were supposed to do, secure advantageous matches for their children. Think of lineage and alliance above all else. Eleanor's voice held something that might have been regret. I watched Julian enter that marriage with dutiful resignation. I watched him spend 5 years in a union without warmth, without companionship, without any of the things that make such a commitment bearable. His wife was a lovely woman, well-bred and accomplished, but they were fundamentally incompatible. When she died, he grieved appropriately for appearance's sake. But I know he felt primarily relief, and I know that I was responsible for that misery. Your Grace, I'm sure you intended. Good intentions are worth nothing if they cause harm, Eleanor interrupted. I forced that marriage on him, Miss Fairmont. I used every tool at my disposal, guilt, duty, family honor, to ensure he complied. And in doing so, I failed him as his mother. I prioritized the family name over his happiness, and I have regretted it every day since. Lillian sat very still, uncertain how to respond to such candor. So now, Eleanor continued, when I see him looking at you the way he does, with genuine interest, with liveliness I haven't seen in him for years, I find myself at a crossroads. I can do what society expects and object to this arrangement. I can remind him of his duties, his responsibilities, the expectations of his position. Or I can allow him to make his own choice, even if that choice involves risks. And which will you do? Lillian asked quietly. That depends on you. Eleanor leaned forward. I need to understand your intentions, Miss Fairmont. Are you genuinely interested in my son, or are you simply accepting his assistance because you have no other options? Because if it's the latter, I will not stand by and watch him mistake gratitude for affection. The bluntness of the question demanded equal honesty. Lillian thought carefully before responding. When Julian pulled me from that fire, she began slowly, I knew him only as a distant neighbor. In the weeks since, I've come to know him as a man of integrity, intelligence, and unexpected kindness. Yes, I'm dependent on his generosity for shelter and support. Yes, my circumstances make me vulnerable to seeing his attentiveness as more than it might be. But I believe I'm clear-eyed enough to recognize that what I feel for him goes beyond mere gratitude. What do you feel? Eleanor pressed. Admiration, Lillian said, and a growing affection that frightens me precisely because of how dependent I am on him. I've tried to maintain appropriate distance, I've insisted on formal business arrangements rather than mere charity. I've been careful not to presume anything beyond what has been explicitly offered. But if you're asking whether I care for your son beyond his usefulness to my circumstances, then yes, Your Grace. I do. Eleanor studied her for what felt like an eternity. Then she nodded slowly. You're honest, at least. That's more than I can say for most young women who see a duke as nothing more than a title and fortune to be pursued. I have no interest in pursuing anyone, Lillian replied. My only interest is in rebuilding some semblance of a life from the ruins of what I lost. If Julian chooses to be part of that life, I welcome it. If he doesn't, I'll manage somehow. Will you? Eleanor's tone held challenge. Without property, without income, without family support, how exactly will you manage? The same way I've managed for 3 years, Lillian said, lifting her chin. Through work, determination, and refusing to let others' low expectations define my possibilities. For the first time, Eleanor's smile reached her eyes. I begin to understand what my son sees in you, Miss Fairmont. Very well. I will not object to this partnership or to your continued residence here while the legal matters are sorted. But I make 2 conditions. Which are? Lillian asked warily. First, you will have a proper solicitor review any business arrangements with Julian. I'll provide a recommendation if you need one. Someone with no connection to either family who can ensure your interests are protected. Eleanor paused. Second, you will be honest with my son about your feelings when the time comes. He's been hurt enough by relationships built on obligation and convenience. If you care for him, tell him. If you don't, tell him that as well. But don't leave him in uncertainty. That seems remarkably fair, Lillian said, slightly surprised. I'm many things, Miss Fairmont, but I am not my son's enemy. I made that mistake once with his first marriage. I won't repeat it. Eleanor rose, signaling the end of their private conversation. Now, shall we allow Julian back in before he wears a path in the hallway from pacing? As if summoned, the door opened and Julian appeared, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes anxious. Well, well, Eleanor said, her tone returning to its usual crispness. Miss Fairmont and I have reached an understanding. I approve of your business venture, though I maintain that the social complications will be considerable. However, I believe you're both clear-eyed enough to navigate them. The relief on Julian's face was palpable. Thank you, Mother. Don't thank me yet, Eleanor warned. I also insist on remaining here for the next fortnight to ensure proper arrangements are maintained. I'll serve as Miss Fairmont's chaperone in society's eyes, which should mitigate some of the gossip. And I'll take it upon myself to make certain connections in London understand that any slander directed at Miss Fairmont will be dealt with quite severely. Mother, that's not necessary, Julian began. It's entirely necessary, Eleanor corrected. Your protection of Miss Fairmont, while admirable, lacks the particular viciousness that only a woman of my age and status can deploy. Society's dragons must occasionally be fought by other dragons. Consider me your champion in that regard, Miss Fairmont. Lillian found herself genuinely touched. I don't know what to say, Your Grace. Say nothing. Simply continue being honest and hard-working, and we'll get along splendidly. Eleanor moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Julian. The medicinal garden you've established is undersized. If you're going to make a proper business of this, you'll need at least 3 times the space and 2 additional greenhouses. I'll have my estate manager send plans from Bath. We maintain excellent herb gardens there. With that pronouncement, she swept from the room, leaving Julian and Lillian staring after her in bemused silence. Well, Julian said finally, that went better than I feared. She's extraordinary, Lillian breathed. Terrifying, but extraordinary. That's an accurate assessment of my mother. Julian moved closer, his expression warming. She approves of you, Lillian. I can't remember the last time she approved of anyone I introduced to her. She approves of honesty, Lillian corrected, which I find rather refreshing after so much deception. As do I, Julian agreed quietly. And the look he gave her then made Lillian's heart race with possibilities she was only beginning to allow herself to imagine. The kiss happened in the medicinal garden on an afternoon when summer was giving way to early autumn. Lillian had been working among the rosemary beds, discussing their medicinal properties with Julian when their hands brushed, reaching for the same plant. The touch was electric, and when she looked up to find him already watching her with an intensity that stole her breath, the careful distance they had maintained for weeks simply evaporated. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly, as though he had been thinking about little else for some time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unevenly, Lillian pressed her fingers to her lips in wonder and alarm. "That was unwise," she whispered, though she made no move to increase the space between them. "Probably," Julian agreed, his voice rough. "But I find I'm tired of being wise, tired of propriety, tired of pretending I don't think about you every waking moment." The confession should have frightened her. Instead, it kindled something warm and dangerous in her chest. "Julian, don't," he interrupted gently. "Don't tell me all the reasons this is impossible. I know them already. You're dependent on my charity. I'm a duke. Society will crucify us both. I've recited those arguments to myself 100 times. They change nothing about how I feel." How did he feel? The question burned on Lillian's tongue, but before she could voice it, Mrs. Hinch's voice called from the terrace, announcing visitors. The moment shattered, leaving them standing too close in the garden with flushed faces and the knowledge that something fundamental had shifted between them. Over the following days, stolen moments became their currency. A touch of hands when passing documents. Conversations that stretched into evening, just the two of them in the library discussing everything and nothing. The night he found her unable to sleep, and they sat in the darkened drawing room sharing wine and confidences until dawn painted the sky pink. That night, emboldened by darkness and Bordeaux, Julian spoke of his first marriage with painful honesty. "I tried to care for her," he said, staring into his glass. "Charlotte deserved better than polite indifference. But we were strangers forced into intimacy, two people doing our duty. When she died, I felt guilty that my primary emotion was relief. What sort of man does that make me?" "A honest one," Lillian replied. "You can't manufacture feelings that aren't there, Julian. The fault lies with a system that values property and lineage over human happiness." "And you?" he asked, turning those blue eyes on her. "Have you never wanted to marry?" "I wanted to want it," Lillian admitted. "When I was young, I imagined the usual things: a kind husband, children, a home of my own. But after my mother died and I saw how my father's grief consumed him, I began to wonder if such vulnerability was worth the risk. And then the years passed, and I discovered I rather liked managing my own life, making my own decisions. By the time I reached 5 and 20, society had relegated me to permanent spinsterhood anyway. Society," Julian said with quiet vehemence, "is populated by fools." They grew closer still after that night, the boundaries between friendship and something deeper blurring, until neither could quite identify where one ended and the other began. Eleanor observed it all with a knowing expression but said nothing, her presence lending an appearance of propriety, even as Lillian and Julian circled each other with increasing intensity. The breaking point came nearly 2 months after the fire, on an evening when dinner had included rather more wine than usual. Eleanor had retired early with a headache. Mrs. Hinch was visiting Thomas in his cottage on the property, and Lillian found herself alone with Julian in a way that felt both inevitable and terrifying. They were in his study, ostensibly reviewing plans for the expanded medicinal gardens, but Lillian found she could not concentrate on greenhouse dimensions when Julian sat so close, when his voice carried that particular warmth he reserved only for her, when every brush of his shoulder against hers sent awareness sparking through her nerves. "You're not listening," he observed, amusement coloring his tone. "No," she admitted. "I'm not. What are you thinking about?" She should have deflected, should have made some light comment and suggested they continue tomorrow. Instead, she turned to face him fully and said, "I'm thinking that I'm tired of being sensible, tired of all the reasons we shouldn't do what we both clearly want to do." The air between them seemed to thicken. Julian set down the papers he'd been holding, his movements deliberate. "And what is it we both want to do, Lillian?" In answer, she kissed him. Unlike their first kiss in the garden, this one held no hesitation, no surprise. This was deliberate and hungry, and full of weeks of denied longing. Julian responded immediately, his hands coming up to frame her face as he deepened the kiss with a thoroughness that made her knees weak. They made it as far as the leather sofa in the corner of his study. The progression from kissing to something more happened with surprising naturalness, as though they had both been waiting for permission to finally act on what had been building between them. Lillian's borrowed dress pooled on the floor. Julian's waistcoat followed. And then there was nothing but skin and breath, and the overwhelming rightness of finally being close in every sense. Afterward, lying tangled together in the dying firelight, Lillian felt the first stirring of panic. What had they done? She was completely dependent on his generosity, living in his home with nowhere else to go. She had just given herself to him without the protection of marriage or even the promise of a future together. By society standards, she had ruined herself completely. "I can hear you thinking," Julian murmured against her hair. "Stop. How can I stop?" Lillian pulled back to look at him. "Julian, we've been reckless. If anyone discovers—" "No one will discover anything," he interrupted firmly. "And before you spiral into catastrophizing, I want to say something." He took her hand, his expression serious. "Marry me, Lillian." The proposal struck her speechless. When she finally found her voice, it emerged sharper than intended. "You don't have to do this. I'm not some naive girl who expects a marriage proposal after one night together. I'm not asking because of duty or obligation," Julian said, frustration creeping into his tone. "I'm asking because I love you, you stubborn woman. I've loved you since you stood in my drawing room covered in soot and demanded to know what happened to your gardens before even asking about your own injuries. I've loved you through investigation and revelation and watching you rebuild something from nothing. Tonight simply gave me the courage to finally say it." "You love me?" Lillian repeated, the words not quite making sense. "Desperately," he confirmed. "Did you truly not know?" She had suspected, perhaps even hoped, but hearing it stated so baldly left her reeling. "I'm nobody," she whispered. "A viscount's daughter with no property, no dowry, no connections that matter. You could marry an earl's daughter, a marquis's daughter, someone who brings something to a union. You bring yourself," Julian said simply. "That's all I want. That's all I've wanted since the day I carried you out of those flames and realized how close I came to never knowing you at all." He paused, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. "But I need to know, do you feel the same? Or is this gratitude, convenience, the natural result of proximity?" It was the same question his mother had asked weeks ago. Then, Lillian had answered with careful honesty tempered by caution. Now, lying in Julian's arms with her heart racing and her defenses in ruins, she found she had no capacity for anything but truth. "I love you," she said, and watched wonder bloom across his features. "I've tried not to. Tried to be practical, to protect myself, to remember all the ways this could end badly. But I love you, Julian, desperately and completely and quite against my better judgment." His kiss tasted of relief and joy and promise. When they finally separated again, he said, "Then marry me. Not because society demands it, not to protect your reputation, but because we choose each other freely. Your mother approves of you. You know she does. Society will say I trapped you, that I deliberately compromised myself to secure a duke. Then society can go to hell," Julian said pleasantly. "Lillian, I spent 5 years in a marriage built on duty and propriety. It was a prison. I won't spend the rest of my life without you, because of what others might say." She wanted to agree, wanted to say yes, and let him handle all the practical objections her mind kept raising. But years of self-reliance and the recent betrayals had left her wary. "I need time," she finally said. "Not to change my feelings, but to think clearly, to make sure I'm saying yes for the right reasons." Julian looked as though he might argue, then nodded reluctantly. "How much time?" "I don't know." "Days? A week?" She touched his face, gentling the rejection. "I love you, Julian. That hasn't changed and won't change. But I've built my entire adult life on making my own decisions, on not being dependent. accepting your proposal while living under your roof, while financially reliant on you for everything. It feels too much like acquiescence rather than choice. You're infuriating, he informed her, but his tone held affection rather than anger. And possibly the most stubborn woman I've ever encountered. I know, Lillian agreed. It's one of my better qualities. They dressed slowly, stealing kisses between buttons and laces, reluctant to end the intimacy even as dawn approached. When they finally emerged from the study, the house was silent, everyone still sleeping. Lillian slipped back to her chamber undetected, her body pleasantly sore and her mind in turmoil. She loved him. She wanted to marry him, but some part of her, the part that had survived fraud and fire, and the discovery that her entire life had been built on lies, needed to be absolutely certain, needed to know that her acceptance came from strength rather than weakness, from genuine choice rather than gratitude or convenience. Over the following week, rumours that had been mere whispers grew louder. Lady Weatherby, the local matron known for her sharp tongue and sharper gossip, made certain everyone within 20 miles knew that the Duke of Windermere kept a young woman in his household, with only his elderly mother as chaperone. The fact that Eleanor had impeccable reputation helped, but could not entirely quash the speculation. The confrontation came at a local assembly that Eleanor insisted they attend. Julian had been reluctant, Lillian more so, but Eleanor argued that hiding would only feed the gossip. Better to face society directly and force them to say their worst to their faces. Lady Weatherby approached them during the interval, her smile sharp as glass. "Your Grace," she said to Julian, ignoring both Eleanor and Lillian. "How delightful to see you in society again. We've all been so curious about your circumstances." "Have you?" Julian replied, with dangerous politeness. "Indeed. It's quite the talk of the county, you understand. A young woman living in your home, working alongside you in your gardens. Some might think it rather inappropriate." Her gaze flicked to Lillian with barely concealed disdain. "Though I'm sure Miss Fairmont is grateful for your generosity after her unfortunate circumstances." "Miss Fairmont," Eleanor interjected icily, "is under my protection and supervision." "Are you suggesting, Lady Weatherby, that my presence is insufficient chaperonage?" Lady Weatherby paled slightly, but pressed on. "Of course not, Your Grace. I simply meant that in a household of two unmarried people of marriageable age, then perhaps you should voice your concerns to me directly," Julian interrupted, his voice carrying across the nearby conversations and causing heads to turn, "rather than veiling them as concern for propriety. If you believe I am conducting myself inappropriately, Lady Weatherby, you have only to say so plainly." The woman stammered, clearly not expecting such direct confrontation. "I only meant, that is, people do talk, Your Grace, and for Miss Fairmont's sake, my sake." Lillian found her own voice, surprising herself with its steadiness. "How thoughtful. Tell me, Lady Weatherby, did you express similar concern when my cousin attempted to have me murdered? Or does your protective instinct only extend to my reputation, not my actual life?" A collective gasp rippled through the assembly. Lady Weatherby's face flushed crimson. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Then allow me to clarify," Lillian continued, the weeks of frustration and fear finding their outlet. "My family conspired to kill me for property that wasn't even legally mine. They hired an arsonist, barred me in my room, and left me to burn. His Grace saved my life and has since provided me safety while the legal matters are resolved. If you find that arrangement scandalous, Lady Weatherby, I can only assume your priorities need examination." Eleanor's hand squeezed Lillian's arm in approval. Julian's expression held something that might have been pride. And Lady Weatherby, for once, had nothing to say. The drive home was silent until Eleanor announced, "That was magnificent, Miss Fairmont. I particularly enjoyed the part where you left that dreadful woman speechless." "I probably shouldn't have," Lillian began. "Nonsense," Eleanor interrupted. "Sometimes society needs to be reminded that propriety without compassion is merely cruelty dressed in good manners." When they arrived at Windermere Hall, Lillian pleaded exhaustion and retreated to her chamber. But sleep would not come. She lay awake, thinking about Julian's proposal, about Lady Weatherby's barely concealed contempt, about the impossibility of living in this liminal space indefinitely. By dawn, she had reached her decision. She dressed carefully and went to find Julian, only to discover he had already departed for London on business. The disappointment was crushing, but Mrs. Hinch, observing her distress, suggested she focus on the gardens until his return. Lillian tried. She worked until her hands ached, transplanting seedlings and preparing beds for winter. But her mind kept circling back to Julian, to his proposal, to the life they could build together if she could only let go of her pride and her fear and her need for absolute independence. By the time he returned 3 days later, Lillian had worked herself into a state of near panic. She met him in the entrance hall, not caring that servants were present, and said without preamble, "I need to speak with you. Privately. Now." His eyebrows rose, but he gestured toward his study. The moment the door closed behind them, Lillian launched into the speech she had rehearsed 100 times. "I'm saying yes," she announced, "to your proposal. I love you, and I want to marry you, and I'm done being sensible about it. But I need you to understand something first." She took a breath. "I will not be a decorative wife who manages your household and attends social functions and nothing else. The medicinal garden partnership stands. I want meaningful work, Julian. I want to build something of my own, even if I'm building it with you. Can you accept that?" For a long moment, he simply stared at her. Then he crossed the space between them and kissed her with enough force to drive her back against the door. "Is that a yes?" she asked breathlessly when they separated. "That," Julian said, resting his forehead against hers, "is absolutely a yes to all of it. The marriage, the partnership, your independence, your stubbornness, everything. Just say you'll marry me before you change your mind again." "I won't change my mind," Lillian promised. "I'm sure now. Completely sure." And she was. For perhaps the first time since waking to smoke and flames, she felt absolutely certain about her path forward. It would not be the life she had imagined months ago, quiet and independent and centered on her gardens. It would be something altogether different, built on love rather than inheritance, on choice rather than obligation. It would be hers, theirs, and that made all the difference. 6 weeks passed before Lillian fully understood the consequences of that night in Julian's study. The morning sickness began subtly, a vague uneasiness that she attributed to nerves about the upcoming trial. Then came the exhaustion that no amount of rest seemed to cure, and the way certain smells made her stomach revolt without warning. She told no one at first, not even Mrs. Hinch. Instead, she travelled alone to a village 15 miles from Windermere, to a physician who would not recognise her name or face. Dr. Green was a kindly man in his 60s who examined her with professional detachment and confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. "About 8 weeks along, I'd estimate," he said, making notes in his journal. "You're healthy, Miss—" He glanced at the false name she had given. "Morrison. But you should consult with your regular physician for proper care throughout the pregnancy." Lillian paid him and left in a daze. 8 weeks. Which meant the child had been conceived that night, when wine and desire had overridden good sense. She sat in the hired carriage on the return journey, one hand pressed against her still flat stomach, and felt panic rise in her throat. She was carrying Julian's child, unmarried, dependent on his charity, and now pregnant. Every nightmare scenario whispered about in drawing rooms throughout England, every cautionary tale told to warn young women away from ruin. She had become that story, except that Julian had proposed, had begged her to marry him. She had accepted. They were engaged, though they had not yet made a public announcement, waiting for the trial to conclude and the scandal around Hugh's crimes to die down. But now, this changed everything. If she told Julian about the pregnancy, he would insist on an immediate marriage. And she would spend the rest of her life wondering if he had truly wanted her, or simply done his duty by the woman carrying his heir. When she returned to Windermere Hall, she claimed fatigue from the journey and retired to her chamber. For 3 days, she avoided Julian as much as possible, pleading illness. Mrs. Hinch grew concerned and Thomas noticed how she abandoned work in the gardens halfway through each morning, too nauseated to continue. On the fourth day, Mrs. Hinch appeared in Lillian's chamber with the expression of someone who had reached the end of her patience. "How far along are you?" she asked without preamble. Lillian's denial died on her lips at the knowing look in the older woman's eyes. 8 weeks, she whispered. Perhaps 9 now. Mrs. Hinch sank into the chair beside the bed. "Oh, child, does His Grace know?" "No, and I can't tell him. He'll think I've trapped him." "Trapped him?" Mrs. Hinch's voice rose. "That man has been trying to marry you for weeks. This isn't a trap, Lillian. This is simply what happens when two people who love each other stop being careful." "But now he'll never know if I married him for love or necessity," Lillian said, tears threatening. "Don't you see? I wanted our marriage to be about choice. Now it will always have this shadow over it." "The only shadow is the one you're creating," Mrs. Hinch replied firmly. "You must tell him. Tonight. He deserves to know, and you deserve not to carry this burden alone." But Lillian could not. Day after day, she meant to tell him. Found herself on the verge of confession, then retreated at the last moment. She stopped eating properly, unable to keep food down and too anxious to force herself. She neglected the garden she had worked so hard to establish. At night, she lay awake imagining every terrible outcome. Thomas noticed first. He found her one morning dry heaving behind the greenhouse, her face pale and her hands shaking. "Miss Lillian," he said gently, offering his handkerchief. "You need to see a physician. You're not well." "I've seen one," she admitted, too exhausted to maintain pretense. "There's nothing wrong, Thomas. Just circumstances." Understanding dawned on the old gardener's weathered face. "Does His Grace know?" When Lillian shook her head, Thomas's expression turned stern. "Then he must be told. I've served your family all my life, child. I won't stand by and watch you destroy yourself with worry over something that could be resolved with a simple conversation." "It's not simple," Lillian protested weakly. "It is," Thomas insisted. "You're having his baby, and he loves you. Everything else is just fear talking." But fear was a powerful force, and it kept Lillian silent for another week, until the morning Mrs. Hinch found her unconscious on her chamber floor, having fainted from not eating properly for days. By the time Lillian woke, Dr. Whitmore had been summoned, and Mrs. Hinch had taken matters into her own hands. Julian sat beside her bed, his face grey with worry, while the physician packed his instruments. "You're malnourished," Dr. Whitmore said bluntly, "and suffering from severe stress that is endangering both you and your child. Miss Fairmont, I understand there may be complicated circumstances, but you must prioritize your health. Rest, proper nutrition, and reducing your anxiety are critical in these early months." He departed, leaving Lillian and Julian staring at each other in charged silence. "A child," Julian finally said, his voice carefully neutral. "You're pregnant." "Yes." Lillian could not read his expression, which terrified her more than anger would have. "I'm sorry. I should have been more careful. You're sorry," Julian interrupted, and now she could hear the emotion beneath his control, not anger, but hurt. "Lillian, we're engaged. We're planning to marry. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because now you'll never know if I accepted your proposal out of love or necessity," she said, the words tumbling out. "You'll always wonder if I trapped you, if this was calculated." "Stop." Julian moved to kneel beside the bed, taking her hand in both of his. "Listen to me very carefully. I proposed to you before this happened. I have been trying to marry you for weeks. The pregnancy changes nothing about what I want, except that now I'm even more determined to make you my wife immediately. But people will say what they always say, that you trapped me, that I'm a fool, that the child might not even be mine." His jaw tightened. "I don't care. I know the truth. You know the truth. That's all that matters." "You're not angry?" Lillian asked in a small voice. "I'm furious," Julian corrected, "but not about the pregnancy. I'm furious that you've been carrying this alone for weeks, that you were so afraid of my reaction you made yourself ill, that you thought so little of my love for you that you believed I would see our child as a trap rather than a gift. Our child, Lillian repeated, the words sounding strange. I haven't been able to think of it that way. It's been this terrible secret, this thing that ruins everything. It ruins nothing, Julian said firmly. It accelerates our timeline, certainly. But we were always going to marry, Lillian. This simply means we do it now, rather than waiting for the trial to conclude and society to stop gossiping. I'm scared, she admitted. Terrified, actually. Of being a mother, of failing you, of being happy, Julian suggested gently. Because that's what you're really afraid of, isn't it? That if you allow yourself to be happy, something will come along and take it all away. He was right. After the fire, after discovering the lies that had shaped her entire adult life, after nearly dying in flames meant to kill her, allowing herself happiness felt like tempting fate. I don't know how not to be afraid anymore, she whispered. Then be afraid, Julian said. But be afraid with me. Let me share this burden, Lillian. That's what marriage means, what partnership means. You don't have to face everything alone anymore. The tears came then, releasing weeks of pent-up terror and isolation. Julian held her while she sobbed, murmuring reassurances that slowly penetrated the panic. When she finally calmed, he remained beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. We'll marry next week, he said, and it was not a question. Quietly, with only family present. Then we'll make a public announcement. Anyone who wishes to count months on their fingers can do so. I'm a duke, Lillian. I've weathered scandals before. We both have. We'll weather this together. What about the trial? Lillian asked. Hugh and Constance's case is next month. The trial will proceed with or without our attendance at every session, Julian replied. Fletcher has all the evidence. Your testimony has been given. We don't need to center our lives around watching them face justice. Over the following days, plans proceeded with remarkable efficiency. Eleanor, informed of both the pregnancy and the accelerated timeline, proved surprisingly supportive. Better to marry quickly and honestly than to wait and pretend the child was premature, she said pragmatically. Society may gossip, but they cannot deny that you married before the birth. That's what matters legally. The ceremony took place in Windermere's private chapel 7 days later. Mrs. Hinch wept through the entire service. Thomas stood witness with uncharacteristic formality. Eleanor gifted Lillian a ring that had belonged to Julian's grandmother, not the one from his first marriage, but something older, more meaningful. This was given to her by her husband on their wedding day, Eleanor explained, pressing it into Lillian's hand. He chose her freely, against his family's wishes, because he loved her. Like my son chose you. It seems appropriate. The trial concluded 3 weeks after their quiet wedding. Hugh Fairmont was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment and stripped of his title. Constance suffered a complete nervous breakdown during sentencing, unable to bear the public humiliation of her disgrace. She was led screaming from the courtroom, and Lillian later learned she had been committed to an institution for ladies of unsound mind. Unable to cope with the magnitude of her fall from social grace, Vale received 10 years. Kerr, having testified against the others, received 8. And Caldwell, the corrupt magistrate, was stripped of his position and fined heavily for his role in obstructing justice. Lillian attended the final day of trial, despite Julian's concerns about the stress. She needed to see it end, needed to witness justice served. When the sentences were pronounced, she felt no satisfaction, only a profound weariness with the entire affair. Is it wrong that I feel sorry for them? She asked Julian as they left the courthouse. Hugh was weak and desperate. Constance was delusional about their circumstances. They made terrible choices, but they're still human. Your compassion is one of the things I love most about you, Julian replied. But don't let sympathy make you forget that they tried to murder you, Lillian. Their suffering now is consequence, not injustice. 7 months later, on a spring morning when the medicinal gardens at Windermere were in full bloom, Lillian gave birth to a son. The labour was long and difficult, but Mrs. Hinch remained at her side throughout, offering the same steady presence she had provided all of Lillian's life. When Julian was finally allowed into the chamber, he stood frozen at the sight of Lillian propped against pillows, exhausted but smiling. with their son in her arms. "Come meet him," she said softly. Julian approached slowly, reverently, then reached out to touch the tiny hand that had escaped the blanket. His son grasped his finger with surprising strength, and Lillian watched her husband's face transform with wonder. "He's perfect," Julian breathed. "You're both perfect. What should we name him?" Lillian asked. They had discussed possibilities, but reached no firm decision. "What was your father's name?" Julian asked, not taking his eyes from his son. "Thomas," Lillian said. "Thomas William Fairmont." "Then William Thomas Montrose," Julian decided, "after both the men who protected you, your father's memory, and the gardener who served your family faithfully." Thomas Greaves, summoned to meet his namesake that afternoon, stood in the doorway of the chamber and wiped at his eyes unabashedly. "A fine boy," he said gruffly. "A very fine boy indeed." Eleanor arrived from Bath the following week, bringing enough gifts to fill an entire nursery. She held her grandson with surprising tenderness, and Lillian saw in her face the echo of the mother she must have been before duty and propriety hardened her. "He has your eyes," Eleanor told Julian, "and your stubbornness, judging by how strongly he grips. Heaven help us all." Lillian recovered slowly, taking long walks through the medicinal gardens that had grown beyond anything she had imagined that first day at Windermere. 3 greenhouses now stood where she and Thomas had planted that initial small plot. Herb beds stretched across an acre of carefully tended ground. Apothecaries from London sent regular orders, and physicians had begun consulting with her about specific cultivars for particular ailments. The partnership with Julian had become something more than either of them anticipated, a genuine business that supported itself and provided meaningful work. Lillian spent her mornings in the gardens and her afternoons with her son, finding balance between the different aspects of her life. The property at Fairmont Cottage, seized from Hugh upon his conviction, had been granted to Lillian by special petition to the Crown. Eleanor's connections and Julian's influence had made it possible, but Lillian chose not to rebuild. Instead, she donated the land to the parish for use as a school for local children, with the condition that gardens be maintained where students could learn practical skills. "It's what my father would have wanted," she told Julian when the papers were signed. "Education and growth, not ashes and memory." Ashes. 10 months after the fire that had nearly claimed her life, Lillian stood in the Windermere Gardens at sunset, her son asleep in her arms, and looked back at the house where she had found unexpected sanctuary. Julian appeared beside her, slipping an arm around her waist, and together they watched the sky fade from gold to purple. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "How unconventional everything has been. The scandal, the rushed marriage, all of it." "Not for a moment," Julian replied. "I spent 5 years in a conventional marriage that brought neither of us happiness. I'll take scandalous love over proper misery any day." "Good," Lillian said, leaning into him, "because I'm told Lady Weatherby is still complaining about us at every opportunity." "Then she has far too much time on her hands," Julian observed. "Perhaps we should suggest she take up gardening. It might improve her disposition." Lillian laughed, the sound carrying across the gardens where herbs and flowers grew in carefully tended abundance. She thought of the girl she had been before the fire, alone, stubborn, convinced that independence meant isolation. She thought of everything she had lost and everything she had gained in its place. The old Lillian would never have believed that near death could lead to profound life, that destruction could clear space for creation, that love could be found in the ruins of what came before. But standing here now, with Julian beside her and their son sleeping peacefully in her arms, with gardens flourishing where there had been only potential, Lillian understood something fundamental. Sometimes you had to burn away everything you thought you knew to discover what you actually needed. And what she needed was right here. For the first time in her life, no one else was deciding the shape of her days. She had chosen this future, and chosen Julian, with open eyes. Not the cottage she had lost, or the gardens destroyed, not the life she had imagined, or the independence she had fought so hard to maintain, but this: family, partnership, love freely chosen and fiercely protected. She had been saved from flames. But more than that, she had been reborn through them. And the life that had risen from those ashes was more beautiful than anything that came before. As the last light faded and stars began to emerge, Julian pressed a kiss to her temple. "Shall we go in?" he asked. "In a moment," Lillian said, wanting to hold this perfect instant just a little longer. "Let me just breathe this in." So they stood together as night fell over Windermere. Two people who had found each other in the worst circumstances and built something extraordinary from the wreckage. And in the gardens around them, the herbs they had planted together released their fragrance into the evening air. Lavender for devotion, rosemary for remembrance, and roses for love that endures. The end. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like on this video. Your support helps us bring you more captivating tales of love, courage, and redemption. Thank you for listening.